Hello, welcome. I'm Alex Reyes. I am the 2026 Georgia TESOL Conference Chair and First Vice President, and I wanted to talk to you all about how to write a conference proposal. And so even though this is on behalf of Georgia TESOL, I'm trying to give you some tips and guidance that would be helpful regardless of the specific conference. Etc. So this should be applicable for anybody who's interested in possibly presenting at a conference. So first, just kind of how to navigate this guide. Again, keeping in mind that every single conference has its own particular procedures, expectations. They have kind of their own norms, their own vibes. But this, again, is going to give you some basics that are generally applicable regardless of those things, right? And so some of the things we're going to talk about is kind of like, what's a proposal? What should I present and why? What kinds of things are typically included in a proposal? And we're going to go through more specifically the specific information. Then some kind of general tips for going ahead and, finding, preparing, writing, submitting a conference proposal, and then what we can expect once we've actually submitted the proposal. So first and foremost is this idea of a conference proposal. If you are not very experienced with participating in different kinds of conferences, the conference proposal, sometimes it's called different things, but it's usually some variation of this. Basically, this is how an organization is going to determine what presentations they're going to offer at their event. Right, and so what you would do is typically you're presenting, you're writing up your presentation. These might be for conventions, showcases, symposia, summits, other kinds of large gatherings, right? Professional development, workshop days, things like that, where you might have multiple people presenting information on different topics, right? And typically this can really range on the organization, but they will typically solicit proposals via what we're going to call a call. So it's usually a call for proposals between 2 and 10 months in advance of the event. Really depends on the size and the scope of the event, the size and the scope of the organization. A larger organization that hosts a larger event is typically going to need a longer lead time to get everything organized, whereas a very small event, a very small organization might not need as much lead time to prepare, solicit, organize, review, schedule, promote, etc. for their different events. So when we think about a presentation, what are we talking about? Why should you present anything? Well, you should present things because you are excited to share them. That's the main idea behind doing a presentation. And so at Georgia TESOL specifically, right, we're a network of educators, education professionals, students, community members, all different kinds of folks who do all kinds of work, right? And so we share our work in a variety of ways. And so even though you might not think of these different things as being presentations because they might not feel necessarily as intimidating as a conference presentation, we do things all the time. When you're teaching, you are presenting your work, right? You're presenting information to your students, professional developments, faculty meetings, open houses, right? Workshops, trainings, research presentations that you might give, board meetings if you have to present information. And then there's your more kind of formalized conference presentation. And these can be a variety of formats. They can be papers, posters, roundtables, panels, and some of these have multiple meanings or might be used in different contexts. So we're going to kind of go through and talk about some of those things. But the idea is that you are doing great work, right? You are doing great work in your community. You're doing great work in your schools, at your workplace, within your organization, right? You are doing great things, and that you should be sharing that with others. So that's why we want to think about presenting our work in a more public format, right? And so when we think about that, we're thinking, okay, so you're going to have this proposal, I'm thinking about a presentation. What kind of information are we typically including, right? And again, everything's going to be slightly different from organization to organization, event to year, right? There's a lot of variation, but there are some basic things that are typically included, right? So things like basic information, which are going to be your personal information, typically how to contact you, how to identify you, etc. Then you get into your session information, thinking about like your format and your focus, and then your really presentation specific information that would be like your title, what your presentation is going to be about. Those types of things are what we're going to look at here. So with our basic information, right, they're literally just going to be your basic information. This is going to help your conference organizers keep track of the proposals, right? Who do I contact if I need more information, or to say, hey, congratulations, you've been accepted for our conference. How do we reach people? How do you want to be named, right? So that's really important with your naming conventions. And then also your affiliation, and that can be if you're working in a school system, right? That might be your local school system. It could be the university if you're in higher education. It might be a specific program that you work with, an organization, etc. So that affiliation, so that people know if I'm looking at a session description, I'm going to a conference and I'm looking at all the different things that I can attend. Who are you? Where are you from? Right? Because that's going to help me understand the context and decide whether this might be a good fit for what I'm interested in, or a relevant fit that I can learn something from. So that's where we get that really basic information that helps keep track. It helps us get in contact, keeps everything running smoothly. Then you get into your session information, right? And so these, I'm kind of calling it format and focus. So the format is going to be your presentation type. And here I've included some screenshots from the 2026 Georgia TESOL Conference proposal submission, right? And so when it asks for presentation type, we're thinking about what is the format in which you are going to present, okay? And there are 4 that are shown here: an individual session, a panel presentation, a poster, and a workshop. And we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those things means. And then the second part, here we've worded it with which strand does your presentation best align. That's what we're thinking of in terms of focus, right? So what is the focus of our presentation going to be? So you want to make sure that you're looking at those guidelines that call for proposals to see what kinds of formats are available for your presentation and what different focus areas might be included, right? And so first we're going to look at those presentation formats. When we're thinking about presentation format, it's really key to think about who are you trying to connect with, right? And then what's the best way to connect with those folks given what you're connecting about, okay? So there's different kinds of information that we want to present. There's different ways that we want to connect, and those formats are going to help us kind of make sure that our mode gives us the right type of delivery for the message that we're trying to send, right? And so I'm just going to go around clockwise from presentation formats, right? We have individual. It's called individual. It might be called individual papers, paper presentation. Again, there's going to be some variation from organization to organization and how they refer to these different things. But the general idea is the same: an individual paper, an individual presentation, an individual session, or a paper presentation are typically a lecture styled presentation, okay? And even though it says individual, oftentimes you might have a co-presenter, right? So it may be one person, an individual presenting, a pair. It might be a slightly larger group that are presenting together on one topic, right? And again, it's more lecture style. There's typically the delivery part followed by a question and answer period, so that the author or the presenter can engage with the audience members, and those attendees can ask questions, get clarification, give comments, feedback, etc., right? And bear in mind when we say that it's lecture style, That doesn't mean that there's just somebody standing at the front and talking. Some conferences do that. Some I've been to conferences where somebody will literally have their paper and just read straight from it. Some have visuals. Some are more interactive where they may elicit some audience response, some participation from attendees as they're presenting. Some choose to do that a little bit more conversationally, but typically it's kind of what you think of as that like person in the front of the room talking to other folks in the room, right? Then as we continue around clockwise, down to the panel. A panel is a group of related papers or presentations that are submitted as a single lecture style session. So a lot of times this is what you see in a large conference, like in a plenary session or something. You can kind of visualize it like a stage with some people sitting at a table, right? And each of the people is going to say their bit, and they might have some comments, and there may be some Q&A and some discussion for that. But that's that panel where the idea is that we're not matching up people based on topic, but that you are submitting a fully formed, these different people and their individual works are related around a theme or related around a project, etc., and that this panel is going to come and present their individual pieces, but that makes sense as a whole. Right? Then we'll move up to the poster session. So a poster session is literally a poster, okay? And a poster is typically displayed in a set location alongside other posters. So it wouldn't be just like your poster and you're walking around holding your poster, but that you would have your poster up alongside other posters. And then within that, they'll be displayed for some period of time. Typically within that, there's a designated shorter time frame that is set aside specifically for attendee interaction. So if you're doing a poster presentation and your poster is going to be up for a whole day, or for 3 hours, or for the duration of a conference, you're not expected to just stand there next to your poster and hope that someone comes along and wants to talk about it. The poster is there for folks to kind of look at, and then the designated poster session time is where people will come around, and then it's nice because it's a little bit more of an informal, you can get more of a one-on-one conversation with folks, right? So they'll come and they'll look at the poster and they'll say, oh, that's interesting that you did that. How did you come up with these things? And you can have those more one-on-one conversations that way, right? This is a really great format if you have a study that you've been working on to actually present your research in that way, right? Because you can have the section with like the findings, and you might have visuals that represent graphs or data, numbers, distributions, quotes from participants, etc. So that's a great way to demonstrate that type of information where you have a study that's in progress or a study that's been completed, and you have findings or preliminary findings, right, that you can report out in this format that can be there. People can take their time looking at it, and then you can have some time for those more one-on-one conversations. Roundtables are typically where you would share work in progress. Again, every organization and every conference is slightly different, but the majority of conferences that I've attended that have roundtable sessions, there are literally roundtables that are set up possibly in a ballroom, maybe in a smaller space, depending on the size of the conference, the number of presenters, etc. And folks at those tables will actually share different works in progress. So it might be that I'm working through this paper and I would like to solicit feedback from colleagues and peers, right? Or maybe I want to get some initial ideas out there and see what other questions people have. Just have those conversations, right, on things that are typically works in progress. And it's a nice way to actually have the back and forth and get that interaction of providing feedback to one another rather than potentially kind of putting your work out there and not receiving that feedback. Not all conferences have roundtables. I've also attended a conference recently that had a session that was called Roundtable, but it was more like a forum. So it was more like what we think of as a panel presentation. There were people in the front, and then that kind of round table part of it was folks in the audience were asking questions. But it was much more like a panel presentation in my experience, even though they labeled it roundtable. So make sure that you kind of go through and understand what these different designations mean, because a lot of these words are used differently in different contexts. And then the last one that's listed here is the workshop. These are typically, we want to think of something that's more hands-on, where you're expecting attendees to your session to actually do something, right? So not to just listen to what's happening and ask questions about it, but to actually participate in some type of activity. So that might be that you are talking about games that are good for oral language development, right? And so you might actually have the participants in your session engaging in those games. So it's more application-based, it's highly participatory. It is not as potentially passive, right? So none of these should be passive. The idea of presenting your work at a conference is that we want to get your ideas out there and have conversations with folks, right? But this is much more of what you think of as your workshop, hands-on, a more tangible takeaway than some of the theoretical things that you might experience in some of the other formats. So these are some of your presentation formats, right? Those might also be called session types, etc. You want to think about your presentation focus. Again, these have different names. Georgia GATESOL, I've seen us primarily refer to them as strands, right? There might be concentrations, areas, themes, okay? And those things might be related to your target audience, right? Specific content areas, different trends that you're exploring, an application context, right? So that's very much based on, what you're trying to get across. So I'm just backing up a little bit to talk about session information. And here you can see for our 2026 conference, right, when we're asking which strand is your presentation best aligned, we're asking you to think about, are we talking about instructional strategies? Are we talking about standards and alignment? Are we talking about developing oral communication? Are we talking about literacy, cultural responsiveness, dual identification, right? Dual language, all of these different things that you might be more focused in, right? Because of course your presentation is going to be related to the conference topic as a whole, but even within that, that helps narrow down how folks can kind of find your work and think about what it's about. So for example, if you are teaching in a high school setting, you might not be as interested in attending a session that's about P5 instructional strategies, right? If you really want to focus on working on developing students' oral literacy, their oral language proficiency, right? Then you might want to kind of zoom in and identify some presentations that are aligned with that strand, right? So again, different conferences will have different ways that they approach organization, but this is also helpful to make sure that the organizers are not scheduling all of the technology integration sessions at the same time. Because if that's something that you're very interested in, if everything's offered at the same time, you can only attend one, right? So you're not going to be able to get that variety that you want. So this again helps with organization. It helps attendees identify which sessions they might be interested in, right? And so it's really important to think about these pieces as you're putting your proposal together, because what are you trying to share? How is the best way to share that? Who are you trying to share it with, right? Who are you trying to appeal to? So these are things we want to consider. And then the last piece of it is, of course, like very specific, your presentation's information. So you want to have a presentation title, okay? And that should be descriptive. So by the title, I should have some idea of what it's about, but it also should pique interest, right? And so that can be sometimes challenging to kind of settle on a title that says what you're doing and is exciting, because you can be very descriptive about your work, but it might not necessarily be exciting and super interesting in the way that it might be if you kind of give it a little bit more appeal, if that makes sense, right? So you want it to be descriptive. So you want to be able to look at the session and not go, what is this? I don't know what this is about. But you want to look at it and say like, ooh, okay, that's a topic that I'm interested in. And that sounds interesting, right? And then the second part of it is going to be your actual presentation description. That should provide an overview, right? So like, what are your attendees going to expect to learn or gain from your session? And if you're presenting research, then things should be included there are things like the background, the study context, methods, findings, right? And so that would help folks kind of determine whether your session is going to fit into the conference as a whole, where it will fit in the conference in terms of the best strand, the best placement, the best timing, and then also for your actual attendees to the conference to be able to look and see which things they would like to attend, because conferences have a lot of concurrent sessions, there's a lot of things going on, and as much as we would all love to do all the things, it is not physically possible. So that helps kind of organize things, and it helps the attendees make decisions about, well, there's 3 things that I'm interested in at the 2 o'clock session. So maybe I already attended something about literacy. So maybe at the 2 o'clock session, I'm going to go to a technology integration thing instead, right? And then tips for preparing your proposal, right? These are going to be, good advice just generally. Read the call carefully, okay? Make sure your presentation fits the call. Your presentation should make sense in the context of the organization and then any specific information, right? So a lot of times a conference will have a theme, okay? And so you want to think about, how does your presentation fit with the theme? Some people like to actually integrate the theme or some part of the theme into their session title or into their session description. That can be really helpful. But what's more important is that it just makes sense with it, right? That if you are presenting work at the Georgia TESOL conference, for example, that somehow your work aligns with English learners, teaching English learners, multilingual learning communities, immigrant communities, students, language, literacy, right? All of these pieces that make sense in that context, okay? So you want to make sure your presentation fits the call. Think about how it fits with the theme, okay? And then actually make sure you can attend the conference, because the dates, the location, and the registration cost, all of those things matter, right? There are some conferences that I've personally been really interested in, and then I see like they don't work with my schedule because I have other obligations, or I would love to go to that place, but I don't get funding support that would cover the cost for me to travel there, right? So those are things you want to be mindful about, your realistic ability to actually attend the conference and give your presentation, right? Then when we get into, okay, so we're preparing, we've thought about it, now we're going to write it, okay? Make sure to communicate your ideas. So really good piece of advice is to draft your proposal on a document before submitting it, right? So there's a lot of different platforms that different organizations use for proposal submissions. Some just ask you to write a brief abstract. Some want you to fill out a Google form. Some have their whole own formats, right? And so what makes it easier for you is to prepare on the front end and actually do that writing, do that drafting on a separate document, right? So then you don't have to worry about the page timed out, or that you thought it was fine, but it turns out there's a 300 character limit, and now you have to reword everything so that it'll fit properly. Make sure that you address every section. Do not leave anything blank unless it says leave blank if this is not applicable, right? So if they're asking you to specifically say, how does this tie to the theme, then you need to specifically say how it ties to the theme. If they want you to specifically include a literature review and citations, that you do that, right? So again, every conference, every call has their own expectations, their own procedures, and it makes your life easier if you draft it on a document first that you can then copy and paste into whatever format the submission has to go in, right? And then the last part, like reach out to conference organizers for help if you need it, okay? Conference organizers want people to participate in the conference. They want people to engage. They want presenters to present and share their great work. They want participants to come and attend the conference, right? And learn from each other and give feedback and just kind of share among each other. And so the conference organizers are available to help. Most conference organizers are working on a volunteer basis, so be mindful that sometimes other things have to take priority, but they will respond to you and they generally are happy to help. So if you read something and it's really not clear, you can reach out to them and ask, hey, this part's really not clear. Can you please, answer this question? In which case they'd be happy to turn around and say, thank you for that question. Here is the clarification point for you, right? And then the last part, when we're getting ready to submit the proposal, make sure you are prepared. Make sure you know how and where to submit your proposal, because again, every organization uses a different system, right? Some are kind of easier, more straightforward. Others are a bit more complicated. Some require you to make an account, make a password, do X, Y, Z, other things, right? So make sure that you know that beforehand so that you are not scrambling at the last minute and saying, oh no, now I need to build a whole account and the time limit is coming because the deadline's showing up, right? And so that's where the next piece comes in about like paying attention to the deadlines. Work ahead, okay? I know we always have to prioritize, so sometimes things have to be pushed back burner, front burner, side burner, put it in the warmer, put it in the microwave, whatever you have to do, right? But be mindful of those things, that the deadlines are there, because that helps the organizers organize everything, right? So they can look at the proposals they've received and they can decide which should be accepted, which might need some revisions to be accepted, and which ones are really just not a good fit. Or sometimes, again, in a really large organization meeting, they might not be able to accommodate all of the proposals that they have, right? And so you really want to make sure that you are on top of it so that you don't miss out because of time constraints. You don't like technology issues can absolutely get in the way, so you don't want that to be a problem. You just want to make sure that you're on it so that you can feel good, like, okay, I got this submitted, right? And again, reach out if you have those questions. Reach out. People are around to help. So you've submitted your proposal, okay? What happens? You'll get a notification from the organization and they will let you know whether your proposal has been accepted, okay? Once your proposal has been accepted, start working on your presentation. It's never too early to start working on it, and sometimes a presentation that might not get accepted for one conference or event might be really helpful to use at a different time, at a different conference, at a different event, right? Or maybe tweaked for some other theme, some other audience, another time, etc. So you start working on it. Again, really keeping that format and focus in mind. What is your goal in sharing your work? Are you just like so excited about it and you need to tell everyone about it? Do you have a teaching technique, a strategy, some activity that you do that has just been so beneficial for your students, or that's just like super fun and the students really enjoy, and you want to share that with the attendees at the conference, right? Is it the fact that you have done research that's really important and is giving us insight to a particular problem, a particular population, some phenomenon, right? And so you really want to get that information out there because it's important for people to know and understand these things. Is there, I keep seeing a lot of things around artificial intelligence. That's a huge trend right now. People are talking about that. People are concerned about that. So, if that's a discussion that people are having and you think it's important to have that discussion, that may be where you want to, focus your presentation. And again, making sure that your format that you've selected makes sense with the focus that you have, right? The audience, the content, the theme that you're trying to deliver, right? And then some organizations provide feedback with the reviews. Some will just say you've been accepted, not accepted. So if you receive feedback, make sure you're incorporating that feedback. If they tell you, hey, you've got to, describe this part in more detail, then make sure you're thinking through how you're going to give more detail when you're presenting at the conference, right? And then as soon as you're able, register for the conference, make your travel plans as needed. Again, technology issues can get in the way. Funding things can be weird. A lot of times conferences will have an early bird rate, or they might have a block of hotel rooms reserved at a special discount. And those things usually have a time frame on them, right? So if you don't register before the early bird deadline, then you will end up paying more for your registration. If you don't book your hotel rooms early on, then you might miss out on the conference rate, or that block may be already used up and none of those rooms are available, right? So there's all these different things that can kind of impede us. And of course, also being realistic that many of us work in organizations where it's not that straightforward and you have to wait for permission and funding and all of these different things have to come through. So we can't be as proactive jumping on stuff as we would necessarily like, but where you can, be proactive, right? So you submit your proposal, you get accepted, you start working on your presentation, you register for the conference, you make your travel plans, and then you have an amazing time at the conference and you share your work and you have great conversations with great people and you get new ideas and you continue to do your great work and to improve it and to learn and share with others, right? So that's a general overview. So please think about submitting a proposal for the next Georgia TESOL conference event. Those events can be found on the Georgia TESOL website. The link is here. It's literally just GATESOL.org. Okay, that's gatesol.org, or Georgia, abbreviated GA, TESOL.org, right? And we also have a YouTube channel, which is at GATESOL, Georgia TESOL 1981, okay? And we have a professional learning series of webinars. Those are recorded, okay? And those videos are posted to the Georgia TESOL 1981 YouTube channel. And we have lots of topics that are of interest. Again, different focus for different formats, for different folks, right? But they have really helpful information on a variety of topics, specifically in the context of what we're talking about right now, which is submitting conference proposals. There are webinar video recordings on that YouTube channel for how to turn a presentation into a manuscript. So if you're thinking about getting into publishing your work at some point, right? Perhaps in the Georgia TESOL Journal, for example, right? Or some other publication. This gives you a great way to think about, you've presented your work, you've gotten some conversations going. How do you want to turn that into a manuscript that you can then submit to a journal or some other publication, right? Specifically, there are webinar videos on publishing in the Georgia TESOL Journal specifically, right? Because again, just like every conference is a little bit different, every journal is a little bit different. So this is tailored to the Georgia TESOL Journal. And then also videos on how to respond to feedback. So that could be, that you gave a presentation and people had questions or comments for you, and now you want to think about that feedback and what do you do with that, right? Or you have submitted a manuscript to a journal and the reviewer gave you some feedback. What do you do with that, right? So there's lots of great stuff available on that YouTube channel. So go ahead and check that out. And I really hope to see you all at a Georgia TESOL event soon.